So, we are delighted to welcome a good friend, Pastor Evan McClanahan, with us today, even though Pastor McClanahan is a Southerner. In a moment, you're going to get to give him a hearty Yankee welcome, but Pastor McClanahan is from Shreveport, Louisiana. There are Lutherans in Louisiana. I don't know if you knew that. Every time I visit the Lutherans who are outside of the Midwest, I have to tell them, you guys have to be louder because the folks in Iowa and Minnesota and Ohio think they're the only ones here. We've got Lutherans in California and Alaska and Washington State. In February, I visited Hawaii. I have a really, really difficult job, but I'm willing to make the sacrifices to serve you guys. We've got Lutherans on the East Coast. Last month, we had a conference in Connecticut. We've got a Lutherans for Life chapter in New Hampshire, and of course, plenty of Lutherans in Arizona. And thanks be to God, some in Louisiana, like Pastor McClanahan. He was baptized on June 7th, 1981 at St. Luke's Methodist Church. He is a son of Holy Trinity Lutheran Church in Shreveport. Steeped in Lutheran liturgy and theology through his upbringing, he attended Centenary College of Louisiana and earned a B.A. in music. He attended Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago for 3 years and had a one-year internship at St. John Lutheran in Royal, Illinois. So as part of his formation, he was exposed to classical Lutheranism in the Midwest. He even met his wife Amanda in Chicago, and they married in 2006. Now, is she a Yankee? She's from Kansas. Thanks be to God. So you guys, yes, very well. You've done your work. Yes. Upon graduating from seminary, he was called to Living Word Lutheran Church in Grapevine, Texas, where he served as associate pastor. If I'm not mistaken, Pastor McClanahan, that is a congregation of the Lutheran Congregations in Mission for Christ, right? He and Amanda were called in December 2009 to serve as pastor of First Evangelical Lutheran Church in Houston, which is a congregation of the North American Lutheran Church. He and his wife have 2 children. While at First Lutheran, he has initiated several ministry, including outreach to Houston Community College students, the First Word debate and lecture series, and also a podcast, which is current, called Theology on Air. Evan has served us on the board of Lutherans for Life in the past and currently serves on the board for a local pro-life ministry in Houston. His presentation, Biblical Manhood, is going to take us through an exploration of the difference between the ways the world describes manhood and the ways that the gospel of Jesus Christ offers a competing vision for manhood to that. He says, faced with the reality of a cultural revolution that we're living through right now, the need for biblical men has never been greater, but also never as rewarding, as I'm sure you will appreciate. Pastor McClanahan will not only deliver, but also demonstrate to us. So, now it's time for our warm Yankee Lutheran welcome to our speaker, Pastor Evan McClanahan.
Well, thank you indeed for that warm Yankee welcome. Yes, my wife is from Winfield. She's a Jayhawk, so if that gives me some credibility or relatability, I'll take it. But thank you so much for having me. It's always so good to be around pro-life people. I tell my kids these are the best people. These are who you want to hang around with. You want to find your spouse somewhere in this pro-life world, pro-life community, people who care enough about those who are truly vulnerable. So it's so glad for me to be here. As was said, yes, I'm down in Houston, father of 2 children, married to Amanda. So hopefully that gives me a little credibility. But I will say that when I was asked to speak on this topic, I initially, of course, said, well, no, I don't know anything about this topic. I don't even go to the gym, so obviously. So I don't know that I'm manly enough to really talk to this topic. I also don't have a degree in gender studies. So, what do I know about this topic? And I guess there's a part of me that also, I feel like the answers to these questions are like hopelessly obvious. Like, doesn't everyone know already? Like, what biblical manhood, does someone really have to say it? Does it have to be explained in some way? But then I look around and I notice that there are lots of competing views about masculinity and manhood. Even in the church, we get this sort of thing wrong. So I said, well, I guess I have something to say about it after all. In fact, just like in the last couple of days on my Twitter feed, I stumbled across a lot of male or masculine material. That is, people are talking about masculinity. It's a major issue undercutting the election right now. So it is very much in the zeitgeist. For example, this is from someone I follow. He says, the right-wing message to young men: lift weights, eat red meat, go to church, read books, make money, build meaningful relationships. The left-wing message: your masculinity is toxic and you should be ashamed of who you are. That was yesterday. So you see how this issue is just right at the heart of the most important, arguably, event in our country right now, which is a major election. This was this morning I saw. 6 reasons why there are no young men in churches. Then it goes on to talk about giving reasons that are too long to list. But basically, the church has become feminized. Men aren't inspired. Men need to be given a challenge. They need to be fighting for what they believe in, and churches aren't doing that anymore. So it's no surprise that young men aren't in church. Then there is this stat, which will refer to something I'll talk about later, but cable installers. You know what percentage of them are men? 95%. How about road builders? What percentage of them are men? 96%. Construction, 94%. Garbage men, 95%. Iron workers, 94%. Coal miners, 96%. Electricians, 96%. Now, like 98% of preschool workers are women, so it's not like there aren't, extremely important vocations that pretty much women only do for very good reason. But there is content out there that is really talking about definitions of femininity, definitions of masculinity. It's right in the culture. It's right in the zeitgeist. So even though the reason most of us are animated to be part of Lutherans for Life is because we come to understand the horror of abortion and the insanity that we allow that in our country, we realize, like the great image of the iceberg that Lutherans for Life uses, right? The tip of the iceberg is this, the presenting issue, but beneath it are all these other issues. And obviously, it should go without saying that if men were biblical men and women were biblical women, we wouldn't need to even ever talk about abortion, because it would be simply unthinkable. But that's not where we are, so we need to talk about it. These days, in the culture, we can't define men and women. That's a problem. So that's something we're up against. And I think about this when I think about my own son, who's 13 years old, right? So he's becoming a young man, and I have that anxiety. Like, what is going to happen? He's going to be getting older. Of course, my daughter's 15, so I have corollary issues there. But he is living in a different world than I did. He is growing up in a different world. In this world, we can't define men or women. In this world, I do not trust high schools. I do not trust universities. I hear the Concordias are nice, so maybe but we're going to homeschool and probably do all of that in-house. He has internet access that I didn't have when I was a kid, so he is exposed to the greatest possible evils. At the drop of a hat, I have to protect against that. And he will end up having many fewer what I would consider to be organic coming-of-age experiences, because my mom let me roam, and I did some probably dumb things, but, I kind of had freedom as a kid. Well, I don't give my son freedom. I don't give him a bicycle to just roam around the neighborhood, and most parents here don't either, because we're scared of the creepy guy in the van, right? So, also, today, his Christian worldview and his hopefully conservative outlook on life will put him in a minority position. Although, again, talk about the zeitgeist, young men are becoming more conservative before our very eyes. Young women becoming more liberal. Young men becoming more conservative. So he may be in something of a majority position in his kind of age group, but generally speaking, if he is a conservative Christian, he will find himself in the minority. That wasn't something I worried about when I was growing up. So there's a lot to consider, and my goal is to try to key in on the most important issues that are the most relevant. Now, as I said, this is a zeitgeist sort of issue, So we're not the only people talking about masculinity. So I want to ask you if you have ever heard of maybe some bad examples, or at least some secular examples, of the pro-masculine talk, the reaction to feminism, which many biblical Christians find gross and abhorrent. So there are responses, for everything there's an equal and opposite reaction. There are secular versions of masculinity. Have you ever heard of the Tate brothers? Raise your hand if you have heard of the Tate brothers. All right. The kickboxers, very wealthy, huge following among young men. These are the guys arrested in Romania for probably being heavily involved in the pornographic industry with young women. So you think, oh my gosh, who would ever follow the Tate brothers? Millions and millions and millions of young men. If you don't know who the Tate brothers are, you should. You should. Who has an X account? Who has a Twitter account? You all should have one. Create a fake one. Create a name. Follow people. Find out what's going on in the world this afternoon. Elon Musk owns it. No, he's not a Christian. But hey, there's a lot of free speech on there. Check it out. Who has ever read the book? This is more obscure, so I don't expect to see any hands. Maybe. Who has ever read or heard of the book Bronze Age Mindset? Okay. It's got a pretty big following. The guy who did it, the whole backstory there I'm not going to go into. But he is out there promoting this idea that young men need to be like they were in the Bronze Age. Smelting copper and being a man. But it kind of comes across as misogynistic, and hyper-masculine. I'm not a fan. I actually bought the book, couldn't get through half of it, threw it away, said this is no good. Who has ever heard of Fresh and Fit? Fresh and Fit. YouTube channel, huge following among young men. It's about eating right, being and exercising, and maybe sleeping with about 50 women until you find the right one to marry. Very, very mainstream. Very mainstream. Who has heard of the Paul brothers? MMA boxers. One of them is fighting Mike Tyson in like a month. Okay, they were Disney kids. They've been promoted. They're now like conservatives. You need to know who the Paul brothers are. These are who, now I think they're lame myself, but young kids these days are following them. How about Jordan Peterson? Am I hitting more bedrock here? Okay, Jordan Peterson, we evolved from lobsters, sit up straight, make your bed, 12 rules for life. I haven't read the book, but it has a huge following. And most of them are young men. In fact, he's criticized. Hey, do you know that young men follow you? Well, yeah, he's from Canada, so he's got this funny Canadian accent thing going on. Anyway, these are the world's responses to, what wave of feminism are we on now? 12th wave feminism. And they're not Christian. They're kind of close to Christianity. They're kind of bordering. In fact, the Tate brothers, the first ones I mentioned, did you know he converted to Islam? Christianity has nothing to offer a man's man, but Islam does. And these are people who have influence over millions of young men. Then the church tries to attract men. We stink at this sort of thing when we try to be cool. We should just kind of be ourselves and be okay with it, but we're not good at that. You ever seen the examples of a pastor driving the motorcycle into church? Anyone? It doesn't always go well. Sometimes they don't know how to drive the motorcycle and they crash it. That's embarrassing. Or this one is really not bad, but to me it's just kind of ham-fisted, there was a church in Missouri, and they're definitely not the only ones to do this sort of thing. They hosted a car show on Father's Day. And it's is that the only thing men, are known for is liking cars, So we have a car show, and it's we hope them, it's this three-tiered approach. Well, we'll get them to the property to look at cars. And then we'll get them to come into worship because we'll have it about Father's Day. And then we'll tell them the gospel. So 4 steps later, we go from the 56 Chevrolet Bel Air in the parking lot to the gospel. I don't know. It just strikes me as these are all kind of bad versions of masculinity. I want to talk about some good versions of masculinity, but first, we have a pretty important question to answer. I don't think, since probably almost all of you are LCMS and you've already sort of dealt with this issue at one level, will be hard for you. Still, it needs to be said, which is, can we say that men and women, while being truly of equal value in the eyes of God, are fundamentally different? Can we say that and not cringe, and wince in embarrassment? Can we say that men and women have peculiar roles as men or as women that only men can fulfill or only women can fulfill? Can we say that men are made so differently from women, generally, if not universally? There's always exceptions to rules, but not just physically, but also temperamentally and emotionally, that it could actually be an offense to God to confuse the roles of men and women. If we can't say that, I'm not sure what we're going to talk about today. The answer must be yes to those questions. God made men and women different, therefore we are going to do different things, we are going to be different ways, and that is okay. In the ancient world, no one needed to ask these questions, right? It was just kind of obvious that men were men and women are women. It wasn't until about 7 minutes ago that all of a sudden we decided to question the validity of that. Has anyone seen the film What is a Woman by Matt Walsh? Yeah? I like Matt Walsh. He's a funny guy. It's a great movie. And the funniest part is when he goes to Africa and he's trying to explain to them the decadence of the West. This tribe, this kind of famous tribe in Kenya that makes the most beautiful garments you've ever seen, right? And he's trying to explain how crazy we have become, how utterly insane the West has become, and they, have these perplexed looks on his face. But, and I will say this, we do live in times where technology has kind of been an equalizer to some degree for genders. There are still dangerous jobs that men ought to be doing, but there are also jobs where men, say as engineers, they kind of sit behind a computer all day, and women can have jobs where so there's some kind of equalization, I will say, in the modern world. But still, I think now, if you see society sort of unraveling to a degree, our city streets becoming less safe. Did anyone see the former governor of New York get beat up on the streets of New York City the other night? That's pretty wild. A former governor just gets beat up while he's walking his dog. He's blind, by the way, so he couldn't even see what was going on. So yeah, I think biblical masculinity is sounding pretty good about right now. Women, meanwhile, they still bear children, contrary to what some people believe. They are best served, among other vocations, of course, to bear and nourish young children, even, of course, as both men and women have a role in raising children. These are just physical realities that just aren't going to change. And more to the point, if we deny these realities, I think we need to say that we are verging on blasphemy. We are speaking against God and the way that He made us. So have no shame, have no embarrassment, no more cringing, no more wincing. God made women and men differently. Then we can have a conversation about where our roles overlap, and then we can have a conversation about where our roles must, for the sake of creation, diverge. There's a ministry that I participate in. It's called Theology by the Pint. Maybe 100, 200 young people get together, have a beer, drink, have a presentation on a theological topic of controversial value. It's pretty fun. And we had one on women in ministry. And they went back and forth. They quoted Greek words, and they quoted biblical arguments, and, Paul was quoted a few times and things like that. But at no point did either side, if you will, say that men and women are different they are so different, in fact, that there are some things. I mean, can we not even agree that there are some things that women should do and men cannot? And the gender confusion is so extreme at this point that we can't even do that anymore. I mean, we can't even say that women should only compete with women in sports. We can't even say that only women give birth. So we do face some uphill battles. So we've answered that question, right? Men and women are different. Now, let's get to the topic of biblical manhood. We start to answer this question with the Bible. That might be a surprise to you, but we're going to go there. We're going to use the Bible for this. But it's not that easy, because then my question was, well, what do we do? Do we do a survey of all the men in the Bible? And we look at common attributes or something and put it on a Venn diagram or something and say, well, they all are this. They're strong, courageous, honorable, powerful, da-da-da-da-da. Do we look at, say, Noah? Do we look at Abraham, Jacob, Moses, the prophets, the disciples of Jesus, Paul, or Jesus himself? I mean, what better role model could a man hope for than God in human flesh? So do we do like a case study type approach? Or do we not look at the men per se, but what the Bible says about men? You know, because the Bible says things that men ought to do, men are supposed to do. What I wanted to do was basically look at all the times in which, well, not all, but some of the ways in which the men speaks to men as unique beings. What does the Bible say that is unique to men? Because there's a lot that the Bible says that is true for men and women. For example, thou shalt not kill. That applies to you as well, women, right? But what is unique to men? I would say this. In the Bible, it is assumed, without any cringing or wincing, once again, that men are leaders. Throughout the Bible, men are leaders. Oh, there are some wonderful women leaders, of course, but it tends to be the exception to the rule, like Deborah, for example. But in the Bible, men are priests in the temple, men are kings, men are prophets, men are judges, men are apostles, men are elders. So men are leaders. Therefore, I think we could say, if that's something that's biblically man-ish, then where do men lead? In the Bible, men lead in the household, they lead on the battlefield, and they lead in the area of spiritual warfare. Now, please understand, this is not a demotion for women, even though the modern world, of course, would say that it is. Actually, what's going on is men have this burden to carry, and, you know, we don't always like it. It's not always a lot of fun, but it's our duty. It's our calling that God has placed on us. So we have this heavy lifting to do as men. Of course, some men take advantage of this, and we would say they're not being biblically men either, right? So if men say, oh, I get to lead, and that means I get to be a bully, or I get to abuse, or I get to harm in the name of manhood. No, that's not being a biblical man either, as we'll talk about. So I'm not giving carte blanche that leadership means you get to bully people and harm people. Of course not. Indeed, Jesus says, whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave. Even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So let's put this ridiculous criticism towards us to the side. Saying that we affirm biblical leadership by men doesn't mean that that gives the right of men to be cruel, to be mean. Jesus says you must serve. Still, men bear the responsibility, as I said. If I had to say sort of 5 hallmarks of biblical masculinity, biblical manhood, I would say there's 5. Well, the first one is that they are lead. It's the most predominant one. They lead. They bear the responsibility for leadership. As I said, household, battlefield, spiritual warfare. Paul writes this in Ephesians, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Again, this doesn't mean that men get to control women or abuse them, but it does say that they are to be leaders of the family. He is therefore expected to provide for his wife and his children, to sacrifice for them, to labor without complaint, and to protect them when necessary. The concept of women fighting on the battlefield, this is kind of an issue if you have maybe daughters that maybe are interested in the military. They may not just be a secretary or something like that these days. They might put them right on the battlefield. This is totally foreign to the Bible. That should be obvious to everyone, and it should be foreign in our own day. Just because warfare is less of a constant threat to the average person than it was in the Bible, or even before the draft, it is still the case that men, by virtue of being the stronger sex, must fight war's battles when the choice is to fight or die. I'm going to tell a story I maybe shouldn't, so I'm going to keep it super anonymous, but I'm on the candidacy committee for my denomination. And a young woman is interested in being a Navy chaplain. And that could mean that she would leave the United States for an extended period of time. You know, if there's a war and you get deployed, and I don't know a lot about the military, but I know sometimes you end up in the Mediterranean Sea or something, right? And I said, as a church body, we should not endorse this. We should not endorse a woman leaving her home. But you see, that's somewhat controversial, I guess. I mean, other people tended to agree with me. But you see how we sort of get to this point, right? If you don't say that men and women are different in such a way that there are certain leadership roles that are male only, like military, or as I'll talk about in a moment, spiritual warfare, you put women in those roles, and you lack a limiting principle to keep a woman from going off to fight in a war while a man stays at home. Does anyone see a problem with this? I do. So these are sort of debates that we're having in the modern world. I think something like women in warfare should be, not necessarily the military per se, but in warfare on the battlefield should be unthinkable to us. Spiritual warfare. You know, when the church is doing its job, we're engaged in spiritual warfare. If we're not doing our job, the devil will leave us well enough alone. But if we're, really, proclaiming the gospel and, stuff like that, the devil tends to get unhappy with us, and we will be attacked, and it will be hard. And so to put women in a position where they should be fielding those attacks is wrong. Men should have the courage and the leadership to field those attacks. Therefore, Christians, and especially pastors, we're going to find ourselves under spiritual attack. And just as no man, biblical man, would conceive of a woman fighting in an army, no modern biblical man should conceive of women being or bearing the assaults of the devil on behalf of Christ's sheep. Okay, so men lead. Now, I will say as a caveat, in areas of, say, politics, I don't know if y'all know, we have a woman running for president right now. You may have noticed that. And interestingly, there was a quote I saw the other day, like Muslims have come out and said, Michigan's a swing state, you have Dearborn, you have this huge Muslim population there, in Minnesota as well, there's a Somali population, and a lot of those Muslim men say, I would never vote for a woman. So it's kind of interesting. But in politics, business, civic life, the Bible is less clear. We do have examples of women entrepreneurs in the New Testament even. So I don't have a clear answer on where or if men must lead in every area of social and civic life. I tried to highlight the three that I think are non-negotiable. But I do think that women certainly seem more free to pursue careers in a variety of vocations, biblically speaking. By the way, just because a man is leading, generally or should lead, that doesn't mean that if a man is doing it, it's being done well. So just because you're a man, congratulations, you still have to be a biblical man, which means you have to do things according to God's standards. This is something that I think sometimes when we talk about ordination and men leading in church and so on and so forth, just because a man is doing it doesn't mean he's doing it well either. So there is that caveat as well. Okay, so that was one, men lead. Two, these will be faster, don't worry. Men are workers. Again, I don't think this should be controversial. Of course, women work very, very hard. No job harder than raising children or staying in the home if that is what a woman chooses to do. My point is that men don't have any excuse. I mean, I can say to my wife, take a nap, you've been working hard, but it's hard for me to imagine a man saying that, I don't nap. I just don't do it. So anyway, maybe I should nap from time to time. But men are workers. Biblical men must not be a non-worker. That was a double negative, sorry. Paul chastises the men who believed the resurrection was imminent in Thessalonica, in the book of Thessalonians. This was the major conflict. You had a bunch of lazy guys waiting for the resurrection, and they weren't working. He says this, we urge you, brothers, to do this more and more, and to aspire to live quietly, and to mind your own affairs, and to work with your hands, as we instructed you, so that you may walk properly before outsiders and be dependent on no one. And we urge you, brothers, admonish the idle, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, be patient with them all. One of my favorite Bible verses, Proverbs 22:13. The lazy man is mocked. Of course, laziness is mocked throughout Proverbs. But it says, the sluggard says, there is a lion outside. I shall be killed in the streets. I mean, you've got to be really lazy to be like, I can't work today. I might get killed by a lion, you know. That's like puts the dog ate my homework to shame, right? You know. So, men work. I can think of very few exceptions. It would have to be some kind of disability or well-earned retirement where men aren't working hard. Sorry. 3, a biblical man, this is now in the negative, doesn't have to be the, gym-going, muscle-bound, physical specimen. Think of Zacchaeus. Y'all ever heard it? Y'all might know this guy Zacchaeus in Luke 19. He was a wee little man. Yes. He was a wee little man. He had this bad habit of ripping off his taxpayers, right? And yet he repents. He is accountable for his sins. And remember how much he pays back, or he promises to pay back? Fourfold. Promised to pay back fourfold, even more than the law required, okay? So Zacchaeus is a biblical man not because he's big or athletic or fast, but because he has the humility to confess that he has sinned before God, and he is willing to set things right. Pride, if there is a sin that, of course, is debilitating toward men more than others, ego, pride would probably have to be at the top of the list. Well, Zacchaeus is an example of a biblical man who doesn't have any of the physical attributes, but he doesn't let pride destroy him. In humility, he restores, he makes things right, he is accountable. Then 4, biblical men build each other's up because, from Philippians, they make it a habit to, in humility, count others more significant than yourselves. Now, of course, I would say that applies to women as well, but it certainly applies to men. Just because men are the stronger sex, that means that they bear more responsibility than women in some areas, but they are never to use that power in a sinful way. Consider Paul's admonition now specifically to men, to fathers. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So, therefore, biblical men, they pay attention to their children, they nourish them, they love them, they bring them up in the way of the Lord. They do not mercilessly abuse them or discipline them or scold them. They patiently raise them and teach them to bring out the best from them. And then finally, biblical men build up women. And we see many examples of this in the Scriptures, in the New Testament especially. We see Jesus and Paul both lifting women to, I would argue, culturally at that time, to unusual heights, even if they did not, put them in the place of an elder in the church. Only a woman, for example, receives this accolade. You may have heard it before. And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. One of the most beautiful passages in the gospel. I'll say that about every verse, but I'll say that about that verse too. But some other examples. Priscilla and Aquila. I'm from Texas now, so I'm like, Achaia? Is that Achaia? Priscilla and Aquila. She's often, Prisca is her kind of nickname. She is a woman, and they're always named in that order, which means she is something of a noble woman. And they were honored in this way. They were honored by putting her name before even his. Paul welcomes the ministry of many women. He employs many women. They're named, for example, in Romans 16 to help build and establish churches. Jesus, of course, receives many women as disciples. That word is pretty broad. It's, there's not just 12. There are many women who are following him. In the Old Testament, women had more rights and freedoms and responsibilities than the neighboring pagans afforded their wives and daughters. And so this actually led to the diminishment of patriarchalism, big word. We're accused of being patriarchal all the time, and to a degree we are, but we're a lot less patriarchal than some of those pagans, where the Romans or the Greeks, where the women were just sort of furniture in the household. To conclude, I want to borrow from one of my own sermons, and this was on the teaching in James. Remember what James says is pure and undefiled religion. For the pro-life world, it's extremely important, right? We have a special love and ministry toward widows and orphans. And so I end up talking about that, but there's content here that definitely applies to this topic of biblical manhood, so I want to quote here from myself. In the old world, the ancient world, women and children were vulnerable because men could easily disappear. Right? Men could just go off to war and never come back. Men could go off to work and never come home. Work was dangerous. War was dangerous. They didn't even have, antibiotics for their disease. They didn't have workers' comp. Okay? They didn't have Aflac, right? Then there were just the garden variety sins that, of course, could destroy a family. Man could engage in adultery. Man could have a child out of wedlock. Man could just go off with someone else. So it's no wonder that women would often find themselves alone, and their children would find themselves to be orphans. Survival in the ancient world was not some kind of human right. It was just kind of what happened if you didn't die that day. There were no welfare programs, there was no Social Security, there was no Medicaid. So these Christians, changed by the love of Christ and given this example of Christ as one of service to follow, they would gravitate to help those in need, widows and orphans above all, while everyone else would often quite literally leave the vulnerable out to die. Christians would not and could not. Pure and undefiled religion was caring for those who could not care for themselves. So now, today though, my question was, well, isn't that all the church should be doing? And yet we find ourselves distracted by a great many other things, because widows and orphans aren't the only victims out there anymore. These days, minorities of all kinds are victims. The poor are victims. LGBTQ people are victims. The homeless are victims. I do ministry a mile south of downtown Houston. I am surrounded by the homeless. They are not victims, but we are told they are victims. Some are victims, don't get me wrong, but anyway. Drug addicts, we are told, are victims. Heck, even criminals, we are told, are victims. So if we're going to do ministry to widows and orphans, it has to be after we do ministry to all those other people first. Pretty much, from what I can tell, the only people in this culture today who are not victims are those who work hard, obey the law, pay confiscatory taxes, and, keep this whole thing going. They're not victims of anyone. They don't get any sympathy at all. In fact, we are actually told, we as in those who are responsible, are told that we're the problem. We don't pay enough in taxes. We don't work hard enough. We don't have enough share of the responsibility. Not everyone who's down on their luck reaches widow and orphan status. In fact, there remains, as far as I can tell, virtually no excuse for a man to be unable to care for his wife and children, shy of some serious disability, which means that churches should basically, now this might be controversial, do no ministry for men, shy of evangelizing and discipling them, and perhaps thank them on a very regular basis for shouldering their burden of this thing we call civilization. So, in other words, men, thank you for all that you do to keep this whole thing going. But biblical men are to be responsible, so, we don't have a special ministry for you. Now, we can have men's lunches, men's breakfast, men's boxing clubs or something, I guess. But we're not really, that's not really the call of the church. Our call is for widows and orphans. So if I'm right about that, what would look different in some of the ministries that are actually taking places in churches right now? Here's one. Food and shelter donations would only be for women and children, not for men. I assure you, all the food banks around me in Houston, it's men lining up. Those organizations say, oh, I'm sorry, you're a man, you don't get help. You can work. Boy, we can't say that today, can we? I'm making you all uncomfortable, maybe, even. Okay. 2, the church becomes the sole provider of social relief, ending the government's near monopoly on charity and returning all of that tax money. Hey, we can dream, right? We can dream, okay? Of course, we're unashamedly pro-life because the unwanted children in the world today are most definitely orphans, so that goes without saying that we become pro-life, we are pro-life. I would say we could create or support job training for widows, maybe women abandoned by their husbands as well. In a perfect world, if we really care for widows and orphans, then as ministry, we would, if we had the ability, we could snap our fingers, we would completely repeal the sexual revolution that we have been living through, which has, of course, led to many orphans, if not widows, a whole lot of single mothers. And then finally, and I don't know to what degree I agree with this, but I think it's something maybe we should ask, which is, should we bring back like public orphanages? The foster system seems to be a place where some bad things sort of happen in private. Of course, some wonderful things happen in private too. Just a question I'm asking, if widows and orphans are our chief concern, then is the foster system as it exists the best way that we're caring for them? Anyway, it should be obvious that if men were biblical men, most of those social problems would simply disappear. Men were made to lead. We need to allow them to lead. We need to encourage them to lead. And contrary to what a lot of the world, what it says is, there's nothing wrong with being a man. So to conclude, biblical men and women are alike in many, many respects. They have the same callings to be virtuous, to be obedient, faithful, and gracious. But men and women are different, despite the radical and absurd claims by those in our own day who possess, of course, an unbiblical worldview. And their differences mean their roles will be different, and that is not only okay, it is good. To the extent that men are uniquely called to lead, that is a burden for them, not a privilege to be abused. It's also a joy, to lead in many respects. Rather than warring against the patriarchy, Taylor Swift, we would be wise to support men who seek to faithfully lead in a biblical manner. The world tells them that they are the root cause of so many problems, leading to a withdrawal from leadership and a truncated view of manhood. Loving and supporting men would be a great way to helping men be biblical men. Thank you for your time.